Hello and welcome to Check Out This Record podcast. My name is Frank, and as always, I am with my good buddy Mark. Of course, this is a show where we recommend albums to each other that we haven't heard in their entirety to review. And we also talk about a variety of other musical goodness as well. You can follow us on Instagram. We're very friendly, so if you have a suggestion, let us know for an album to review. You can also listen to our episodes on YouTube as well. Mark, how are you, my man?
Doing good, Frank. I'm really excited for the podcast today. Got a nice glass of whiskey for me so I can say some outlandish things in the hopes that more people on the internet will tell us what idiots we are. So I'm really pumped for tonight.
Well, I'm glad you are. And you know how I love to beat a dead horse, right, Mark?
And do you?
I sure do. And, we have been having our little Rock Hall talks. And last episode, we never mentioned that Dave Matthews got snubbed. And I totally want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, listeners at home, you're going to notice when this podcast comes out in relation to the Grammys. And we wanted to talk about the Grammys so much that we went back to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because the Grammys are I don't know if they're even worse than the Rock Hall of Fame, but they're pretty terrible. Where do you think, is it in the hierarchy of things I don't care about?
Yeah.
I feel like the Grammys are just way above the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Just who could care?
Yeah. I think the Rock Hall does hold a little bit more weight just because there was some good that they did. I could care less about the Grammys, man.
Yeah. So, but to talk about Dave Matthews, honestly, I was shocked that they didn't make it in. I thought it was, an easy one, a layup, if you will, for the Dave Matthews Band. Because really, what's the criteria for getting into it if it's not selling a ton of record and having a global fan base? What the hell is it?
Right.
So according to Terry Stewart, the president of the Rock Hall and a nominating committee member,
okay,
the only formal criteria for the performance category is that an artist hold on, I'm reading a quote and that just tripped me up.
I found this on the web.
My watch is telling me what crap it is too. That an artist has to have had their first record 25 years ago. That said, the candidates are reviewed and discussed relative to their impact on the music that we broadly call rock and roll. Frank, we both know that's bullshit, right?
Absolutely, hands down.
The innovation and influence of these artists is also critical. Gold records, #1 hits, and million sellers are really not appropriate standards for evolution. I.e., that's all horseshit and politics. Fuck the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Oh, I gotta do it back in my voice. Yeah,
yeah.
Look, we gotta figure out, so if you're saying that it's got to have an impact on rock and roll that has included its evolution,
mm-hmm.
right? And I got to tell you, I kind of bite that a little bit. I kind of agree with that. What has this band done for rock and roll? How has it progressed it?
Sure.
I think that's a great criteria for this thing. However, many of the artists have done nothing for rock and roll.
Well,
right?
that was my next point. Whitney Houston has no correlation with rock and roll.
Right. So I think the Rock Hall is really trying to, for lack of a better term, have its cake and eat it too. You can't tell me Madonna's in it and that it's about the impact on rock and roll. What impact on rock and roll?
Right.
So it's a really interesting thing. I think, you could look at James Brown.
Mm-hmm.
You could look at, some of those other early influences, or not influences, but entries, and say, well, yeah, those guys had a definite influence on rock and roll. And I think, the album I'm going to ask you to review later, The Animals, is a great example of that. That early 60s rock and roll coming out of England that was really heavily blues influenced.
Totally.
I think there's an argument for that. And for that, I say, yeah, but, in terms of being a rock and roller, he was a blues guy and a soul guy. So it's really this very interesting bullshit aesthetic that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is trying to pass off. Why you wouldn't put Dave Matthews in it just to get the ratings spike when they televise the induction concert, excuse me?
Yeah.
It's beyond me. Because their fans are mindless. No, I shouldn't say that. Their fans are rabid. They're passionate about that band.
Yes.
I don't care for them. I don't care for the music he makes. But people do. People love him. I don't know that anybody thinks he's like a great poet. You know what I mean? I don't think that we'll be quoting Dave Matthews lyrics the way people quote Lennon. You know, like, but.
Well, you know, one thing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame may want to define is the word consistency, because it seems that they're not being consistent at all, right? I mean, it just seems to be absolutely all over the place. Again, we just named a couple names who had no significance to rock and roll in general. So they have to define what exactly that they're looking for, because right now it's just all arbitrary. That's basically what it is. So you got a bunch of people in a room making their little snooty little votes, and it's just become arbitrary. And by the way, that voice, it reminded me of Thurl Ravenscroft, the guy who did You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch. For some reason, I have to be honest with you. That was pretty cool. I liked it.
That was the voice I made up as I was going to read it. I hadn't planned it. I just knew that I was going to make a dumb voice. I didn't know
it just reminded me of good old Thurl, if that's how you say his name, which I think it is. So
sure. Well, back to you, Frank.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, sir. Well, again, the consistency is the key, and there doesn't seem to be any consistency, and who knows how it's going to spiral out of control. But yes, it does carry a little bit more weight than the Grammys, which neither of us could care about as well. So that's my thoughts on that. But what's cool about this episode, now we're going to go back. So we're going to go back, my friend, to the year 1965.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. A lot happened in that year. And of course, musically, yeah, the Beatles, Stones, Beach Boys, Dylan, the Supremes, and many more on the airwaves. Now, we haven't done this for a few episodes. So before, of course, we get into the year 1965 and the album reviews, let's do a quick top 5, shall we?
Yeah, absolutely. Top 5 Beatle albums?
Let's do it, my man. Would you like to go, or would you like me to go?
I would love to. So, and I say that normally I'm very, listeners know me by now. I always say in the exact order, but in no particular order, but in exactly the order. I mean, this one's tough for me. I grew up on the Beatles. It was a household thing. I listened to these albums nonstop. I worked at a radio station, an oldies radio station at that.
And I remember that too.
Yeah, right out of college. So I listened to the oldies a ton. I listened to the Beatles a ton. This was a really difficult one for me because these, and I think, listeners will figure this out as we go through the list. The late period Beatles really, for as accessible as these records were to children, that you didn't have to really overthink them. There were some adult themes that you could dive deep into, but on the surface, they were just gorgeous pop records. My numbers are going to bounce, like genuinely. I think if you ask me this question tomorrow, Frank, you might get these in a different order, but they're always somewhere up there. So my top 5, and just to show how hard it was for me to make this list for you,
yes.
Rubber Soul and Revolver tie for number 5.
Oh, there you go.
They're just like total dead heat for me. The songwriting is amazing. The imagery is amazing. The music's amazing. And you really, these two records are the beginning point of getting out of the straight pop music world that the early Beatles were. The very simplistic, very record label driven albums. These were the first ones where they really had time to spend a little bit of time in the studio and grow. So Rubber Soul and Revolver, to me, they're two amazing records. They always duke it out in terms of placement. But they're both just amazing albums. And you can really hear the Beatles learning how to be in the studio at this point.
Right.
Number 4 is Magical Mystery Tour. this record was on all the time in my house.
Yeah.
It had that whimsical nature to it that always just made me smile. There was something just intrinsically fun about Magical Mystery Tour, and I just loved it. Sgt. Pepper comes in at 3.
Nice.
This, I think on the surface, and this Beatles record in particular comes off very silly and whimsical. But what was beautiful about it, especially as you get older, is that you learn about the darkness and how personal those silly songs can be, and what's really tucked into them. And I think Sgt. Pepper's so perfect for that. It's so perfect at putting one thing up and meaning another, and being this deep layered, you're watching TV and you're seeing actors do something, but it's more about what's going on in the background. And that's Sgt. Pepper for me. And I can't say how great this record is enough.
Yeah.
So number 2, Let It Be. I'm a big fan of Let It Be. This record hits me right in the heartstrings. It's just, beautiful song after beautiful song. It's incredibly painful, incredibly sorrowful, and yet still hopeful. I just fucking love that record, man. And then number 1 is Abbey Road. Definitely the most played album of my childhood, especially once I could get my mother to just kind of like accidentally lose Rumors, and like we didn't have to listen to Fleetwood Mac, and I would just listen to Abbey Road ad nauseum. I absolutely love it. And this is a record that flips back and forth between Let It Be for me.
Yeah.
It's a little cuter on the surface. It's a little safer on the surface. There is still a ton of depth to it. But this one, what I love about, especially this period for me of the Beatles, is that it's one of the few things from our childhoods that still holds up. When you go back and watch Vulture Hunt cartoons, you're like, God damn, this was stupid.
Or like, Alf.
Right, or Alf. Like, I loved it.
I know.
Why the fuck was I watching this? And Beatles records you put on and you go, holy shit, man, this thing sounds amazing.
Yeah.
The songwriting was brilliant. The structures are gorgeous. The lyricism is phenomenal.
Totally.
So this was a very difficult list. And I would honestly say, if next year, we wait a calendar year to do this list again, there's a quality chance that all of these albums are mixed up. And I know a lot of people are going to ask how I couldn't put the White Album in here, or why I didn't put the White Album in here. And honestly, ask me in a year, it might float in, it might float out. This is how I felt today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the Beatles, and we talk about that when we do these lists all the time, that, it's kind of, they fluctuate and they change with time. This for me is really that one that's, it's not so much a pyramid of hierarchy as much as a sphere that spins, and the one that ends up on top just happens to be the one that ends up on top of where I am as I'm making it. I've gone ahead and rambled. I'm going to drink whiskey. You tell me your top 5.
Nice. Well, there's definitely some similarities. So coming in number 5 for me is Sgt. Pepper. I know this actually ranks on most lists as number 1. It may have been the first album where I sensed the songs were intertwined to each other, and this whole concept of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I remember, though, Lennon saying once that some songs have nothing to do with this whole concept of Sgt. Pepper and Lonely Hearts Club Band, but they said it worked, or it worked because they said it worked, and I always thought that was interesting too. However, you can't discount just some incredible songwriting on this album, and I think it's fantastic. It was also, a side note, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys heard Rubber Soul and really wanted then to make an album that had that sort of creativity, and that eventually spawned Pet Sounds, and the Beatles heard Pet Sounds and then really started working on Sgt. Pepper. So it was this kind of whole back and forth with a lot of respect. So Sgt. Pepper has so much significance and importance in so many different ways too. Number 4 is actually, I pulled an early album, and it's Hard Day's Night, and this is the reason. One, I think the movie's fun. I have a great affinity towards this record too, because I learned a lot of guitar early on from this record. I think it's the best collection of the early songs. Hard Day's Night, Should Have Known Better, and I Love Her, Can't Buy Me Love. I think you can listen to it. It's fun, it's quick, it's short. Again, not as much depth as the later records. However, though, I think for the early records, this is the one to listen to. I wasn't that big of a fan of With the Beatles, which is the second album. I felt that there was too many covers. This is all original compositions, and again, the movie's fun. Number 3 is Revolver. I used to like Rubber Soul better, but Revolver to me, for some reason, just has way more, not way more, but just a little bit more depth to me. I mean, you can listen to these albums really back to back and be just very, very pleased. But my wedding song is on Revolver, Here, There, and Everywhere. So I kind of tend to go to that one. Eleanor Rigby, of course, is just another fantastic song too. The second album, I'm sorry, is the White Album. So, these are individual efforts, and that's the way it was at the time. They were really recording these songs. They were like in business for each other, right? There's some fillers in here. I mean, Revolution 9, I mean, I'm just not digging it. So they could have been left out, right? And there could have been that one good album together. But man, I mean, Helter Skelter, I think could be my favorite Beatles song. Rocky Raccoon, Back in the USSR, Dear Prudence, all those things are great. And number 1, Mark, me and you share the same, Abbey Road. I think, remember on a road trip me and you went to, I brought Abbey Road along. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yep. That was in my mom's car because we had to take it that weekend. But I think this features just really a lot of the band's best individual efforts, and then that middle section of those Paul songs is just great, and I love it. So Abbey Road is top for me, but a year from now, let's revisit this, Mark, and I'll probably have a different list.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of what's great about the Beatles. What's interesting is that a year from now, neither one of us is going to be saying, the Beatles just don't hold up the way I wish they did.
Yeah.
I'm classically a John Lennon guy.
Yes.
Frank, you're classically a Paul McCartney guy.
Absolutely.
That's why our band didn't work out.
Is that why?
No.
No.
But I think it's interesting what you and I pull from these records in terms of who we prefer as a songwriter. But at the same time, looking at the songs Paul wrote as a Lennon guy, man, I got to admit, McCartney is just a phenomenal songwriter, and it's too bad that these guys couldn't see eye to eye before one of them died when John Lennon was shot. It's really just a heartbreaker. Yeah,
I mean, I think a recent interview on Howard Stern with Paul, I think Howard asked him the question, were the four of them ever in a room after the Beatles broke up, just the four of them individually together? And Paul's like, no. And it was because the business side of things were so bad. And yes, I'm more of a McCartney guy, but obviously I appreciate the efforts of Lennon. I think early on, Lennon was the guy. And then what happened is then Paul's really just output just started going haywire, and he really, I think, kept a lot of these things together. But it's so funny. I mean, they were a band for 8 years, right? A band the time of their big success was, I think, right under the decade, right? So it's insane. It's absolutely insane. And I like later Beatles better. I think you're the same, right? You like the later Beatles better?
I definitely do appreciate the later Beatles better. I feel the songwriting is more diverse, and it's just it's got more depth and more heart to it. With that said, I think you and I are going to maybe have to find some George Harrison work.
Yes.
To dig through and really get into, because he was, quietly just an absolutely brilliant songwriter who had to deal with these two very, very talented songwriters, but was still very capable in his own. And let's face it, Ringo didn't do anything.
Yeah, let's break it down for a second. He really didn't at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Well, I think one time for an episode, we need to look at All Things Must Pass, which is the triple album by George Harrison that was released in 1970. That My Sweet Lord is on there. Just so many good stuff. A lot of good stuff on there too. So we will definitely get to George Harrison for sure. But right now we're talking about 1965. So let's look at some of the albums released, and these are like in chronological order from that time. So you had the Rolling Stones Now, Beach Boys Today, Beatles for Sale, which was an early record, Beatles Help, Highway 61 Revisited, Animal Tracks, which we'll talk about, Hollies, their album, The Hollies, Beach Boys Party, Rubber Soul, of course, so many others from Elvis, Cash, Temptations, Miles Davis, the Byrds, Sonny and Cher, even Otis Redding, Four Tops, The Kinks, and more. Your thoughts on what was happening, I guess, musically that year? I mean, as far as the output goes, Mark.
Man, Frank, I'm happy you asked this. What an amazing year for music. I mean, just the back four on that list of yours, right? Sonny and Cher, some of the most enduring pop music, right? Those songs will go on forever. Otis Redding, it's Otis Redding. He's undeniably one of the greatest pop, not even pop, but like R&B soul voices. And I think his recording period was far less than the Beatles. The man was amazing and taken before his time. The Four Tops.
Come on.
Four Tops are amazing. And the Kinks. The Kinks are phenomenal and just don't get the credit they need. 1965, dead smack in the middle of the 60s. That kind of bubblegum stuff from the late 50s had gone away. It had trickled its way into the 60s, but really by 65 it was gone. The folk movement had started to swell. And by 65, the electric folk movement was really just starting to gain steam and really trying to build, and just a wonderful time. And then, we get to Woodstock, and, they ruin it for everybody. But, we're talking about, early days of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of strife in society. Globally, 1965 is a really interesting year.
Yeah.
And musically, just the best of that has come out. People who hear me talk ad nauseum about music know that the only positive thing I had to say about Trump being elected was maybe we'll get some really great music out of it. So far, I haven't found a ton to back that argument, but 1965 and that era of music would suggest that great turmoil in the world can really produce some phenomenal music. So this will be, I'm going to shut up now and drink more whiskey.
There you go. Well, 65 is interesting because you said it was before kind of Woodstock, which, obviously that's another discussion. I couldn't say I was the biggest fan of a lot of that stuff. But at the same point in time in 65, I was a fan. So it was kind of right before that. Right. And then of course the 70s, that was a whole other mess with disco and things of that nature. But, I mentioned the Stones, Dylan's, Beatles, and Beach Boys specifically because these releases in 65 laid the groundwork for what was to come. So Dylan releases Highway 61 after I was Blonde on Blonde, right? Very notable albums, Rubber Soul and Revolver, which we talked about. Led way to Sgt. Pepper in the later style. Of course, like I said, Beach Boys Parties was followed by Pet Sounds, which had a big influence on so many people, in particular the Beatles too. Stones the following year released Aftermath, which is one of my favorite early albums. And then a few years later, we all know what happened, right? We had Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street. I mean, so much important stuff here musically. Do you look back and say, man, how did the bands have that lightning quick output? I mean, today the bands take their time. Some release albums years and years apart from each other. In hindsight, do you think that output was a one-up on the competition, or do you think creativity was just at an all-time high there?
I think it's a little bit of combination. I think record industry certainly had a lot more pull in what was happening, how quickly you needed to release stuff. For folks who were listening last week and heard me pitch the Animal Tracks album to Frank, a thing was happening was a lot of singles were being recorded without necessarily an album in plan, and then those singles were collected and released as albums. So that's why you see bands with 2 and 3 albums being released in a single year, is because they were just pumping out singles, and then the record label would come behind and jam them together. That's why you're going to hear a lot of covers on this on the album I gave Frank. It was a really interesting time for the music industry, and because we don't really have that pressure today. There was a time in the late 80s into the 90s, into even the early 2000s, where bands were a little tighter with it, right? We were talking about albums every 2 years, every 3 years, slowly into every 4. Now you get a record when you get a record, you know? It depends on what the bands want to do at how those records come along. And I think there's credence in that, but there's a really interesting thing in that early 60s and the mid 60s and the late 60s and almost into the 70s. But the 70s, we start getting a little more freedom from the record labels, where these guys were just pumping out these records, pumping out these songs and seeing what happens. I feel like, you know, really the creation of an album, and Sgt. Pepper is probably a great example of it, of thematic albums.
Yeah.
They really cohesively stand as one piece of artwork as opposed to a collection of artwork, really began. So it's an interesting time, and it's a great comparison to really look at how records are made today, or not how records are made today, how records are composed today,
right,
compared to how records were composed back then.
Yeah, totally true. And, you know, man, these are such classic records, right? And I wonder do you think, even though they're so classic, do you think, again, this output maybe affected any sort of quality of the records? I mean, do we think all this was needed? Nowadays, again, a 10-song album from a band we like every 3-4 years is just fine. I mean, I guess, again, in hindsight, yeah, absolutely. With the Beatles being in the short time that they were a band, that was totally needed. But I wonder if some of it, maybe even the bands look back and be like, man, that was overkill. I could have definitely done without that album, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, if you look, for me personally, at those early Beatles stuff, you know, again, with the covers, with the amount of, you know, songs just kind of jumbled in, not jumbled in, but like maybe picked a little faster than they would have been. You certainly didn't get the time in the studio to really elaborate on them. You just had time to bang out the track, move to the next one, put out a record. If it's got a hit, we'll keep going with it. If not enough hits are on the record, we're just going to go do another one so that we've got something else to sell. Very different time in how music was made and how music was sold.
Yeah.
Music is sold in a very different manner these days. So it's very interesting. The quality question, I'm sure some of those bands look back and go, oh, I wish, you know, I could have done something different on these records. But for the most part, I think they're all pretty happy with them, considering the time that they were in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's about the time, right? And their impact at that particular time and how they were there. I mean, back to the Beatles, for example. With the Beatles is probably my least favorite. I feel there's way too many covers, but, you know, some people, that could probably be one of their favorites. And it just happens to, when was it released? Did it strike a chord with you? The impact of it? So many different factors. And we could go on. And that's kind of what we're doing. But maybe you want to get to the reviews, my friend?
Sure. I would like to say on one last thing about this era. You know, cover albums can be a lot of fun.
Yes.
And I think there was a little bit of that. There was a little bit of giving people what they know and love is always easier. You know, we see it in movies today, right? We're just remaking stuff instead of writing something new. And in the way pop music was a commodity back then, I mean, and it certainly still is today, but the way it was much more of a singular commodity, that really drove it. So something to be considered with that. And certainly the way songs were just moved around and passed and played. And it was interesting. We'll get into that with the reviews, certainly, but just lots of fun. So that's what I wanted to say.
Cool, man. And I totally agree. And this is a fun time, and it's really fun for me and Mark to go ahead and be looking at albums of this time. And I guess we'll start with the album I had for you, if you don't mind. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So this is really, I think it's a unique album. I'm a huge fan of it. I'm actually holding the record as we speak. So this is Dion's Kickin Child. It's the Lost album from 1965. He's my first musical idol Dion DiMucci. Again, the album is called Kicking Child. It wasn't released until 2017. After his vocal group, the Belmonts, broke up in the 50s, he went solo and was the first rock and roller to be signed by Columbia Records. Now, this is straight from him. He made a YouTube video in 2017 when this came out, and you could find it, and it's pretty cool to hear the story behind it. So again, he was the first rock and roller to be signed by Columbia Records. Eventually, folk singers like Dylan started getting signed, so Dion put a band together called The Wanderers and wrote songs that landed on this album, Kicking Child. Now, the recording was them playing the songs live, which really doesn't happen anymore, and the songs were way more mature. The label had no idea what to do with them because they thought that they had, again, just the old Dion, Bobby Darin. So he left a lot of money on the table. And 50-something years later, here we are. Here we have a different Dion. I mean, if I open up the album, you see Dion with a beard, the acoustic guitar, kind of really resembling those folk guys. There's even 3 Dylan songs on here as well. I happen to love it. Mark, what did you think of this album?
Man, this record's cool. I was excited about it from the beginning. I did get a little nervous, though. I was worried, with 3 Dylan covers.
Yeah.
How was he going to be able to deal with that? How do you approach Dylan songs when you're kind of, the smoothest guy ever? So I got a little concerned, and, it kicks into Kickin' Child. It kicks into Kickin' Child. Listen to me. Cliche Magoo over here, ladies and gentlemen.
There he is.
But the album kicks off, and it just feels right. You get this kind of like, okay, there's going to be a Dylan feel to this. Excuse me, I don't know if you guys could hear me burp right there. But Kickin' Child, it just really kicks this album off in the right way. Right, we're a little up tempo. You've got some great lyrics. His voice, while being still smooth as silk, is still light and genuine. Honestly, like you said, I hope that in 50 years, people can find something I did and go, wow, this dude was cool. How did this nugget never get released? But, it is what it is. It's just a wonderful blend of his voice and what in retrospect would be that late 60s folk sound. I think this record may have been a little bit ahead of its time for a record that never came out. So for the number of Bob Dylan songs, I think we just need to kind of address them right up front.
Yeah, let's do it.
Farewell and It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. Those 2 in particular, I'm just, my God, just talk about turning really heart-wrenching songs from, when you listen to Dylan on record, you don't assume he's the most loving guy. You don't assume, that he hasn't cheated on his woman. You don't assume, Dylan's got that kind of rough aesthetic to him that you kind of believe he's kind of a scumbag. So when he sings kind of lovey songs, you don't always, you kind of feel like he's a little bit of a shyster, right? Right, little bit, like you still believe him with the political stuff. You still believe him with, the workers' rights and all that. But like when it comes to these kind of like really personal songs, Dion did him all the justice in the world. I mean, these songs work so good. They really just pulled at me. These 2 in particular, just really, I found myself going back to them over and over and over. Just really well done. The singing's on point, and it's, quietly probably some of Bob Dylan's best lyrical work.
Right. And
really
Dylan's first to say, by the way, that he likes the covers of his songs better than his own. And real quick, and I didn't mean to interrupt, but real quick, on the back of this album, I just noticed, here's a quote from Dylan, and I'm going to read it to you real quick. It says, Dion comes from a time when so-so singers couldn't cut it. They either never got heard or got exposed quick and got out of the way. To have it, you really had to have it. No smoke and mirrors then, not a minute to spare, rough and ready, glorious and grand. grieving with heartache and feeling too much, but still with the always better not try it attitude. If you want to hear a great singer, listen to Dion. His voice takes its color from all palettes. He never lost it. His genius has never deserted him. Bob Dylan. So I just wanted to read that to you.
No, hey, look, I mean, thanks. Now my review's half as long. But no, I mean, Dylan's right. Like, it's amazing how he can turn this style of music into his own. You know, I think a lot of people like me don't look at the later Dion stuff. They see the early stuff. They see it for the beautiful songwriting it is, and take it. Honestly, I have nothing bad to say about this record. I was a little worried about getting bored with it. I was worried it would have that, you know, that early 50s kind of repetitious sound and not really go anywhere. But it really does. You know, it worked while I was driving. It worked while I was sitting in the office, just kind of doing stuff. Just amazing. You know, it's just such a genuine feeling record. Sorry, that Bob Dylan quote really just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say after that.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I loved Tomorrow Won't Bring the Rain.
Yes, that's my favorite track from there, man.
Just amazing. Like I said, Kickin' Child's amazing. Farewell, You and Me, Babe.
Yep.
Are probably my favorites on the record, but my absolute favorite was All I Want to Do in Life. Or All I Want to Do is Live My Life.
Yeah.
You can really, like, you feel him swaggering. You feel him kind of in a honky tonk with a little bit like me right now with a glass of whiskey.
Yeah.
You know, croning to a lost love and opportunities that have gone by, and you believe it. You know it's Dion. You know he's just this gorgeous voice and this awesome rock and roll persona, but you believe it. He sells it phenomenally. And I would say that this record proves to me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Dion DiMucci was not an artist's sin.
Right.
That he was truly an artist, and he was able to use his voice in a way that shaped the sound of music for generations.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I will 100% be looking for this record to add to my collection.
Man, it just, again, think 50-something years until it was all put together, right?
Yeah, my liver's not even going to last that long.
Yeah, and Tomorrow Won't Bring the Rain, that's my favorite as I'm looking at it. But, I mean, it's just a great album. I could play this in the house. The kids absolutely love it. It's just great overall, and I am so glad that you enjoyed it, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. So now that Frank has won the contest, you want to review the record? So I gave Frank The Animals. The album is Animal Tracks. As we discussed last week, this was, and even earlier in this episode, this wasn't the UK version we wanted to listen to, which was a little bit more of a cohesive album. This was the US release, which was a little bit more of that. We're going to take a handful of singles, smash them together, and that's the record. There were some great hits on here, but not their biggest hit. I really thought that the depth of this album would really surprise you, especially for that. Yeah. So without further ado, Frank, what'd you think, buddy?
Sure. So The Animals, Animal Tracks, as you said, it's the band's third album. This is in the U.S. So we have 10 songs, though the Spotify version has a couple extra tracks, but I went with just the classic track listing. That's, to me, just easier to digest. 5 of them having writing credits towards The Animals, and obviously then 10 total. Like you said, it's a mismatch of hits and leftover songs from the first 2 British LPs and some B-sides. I'm really glad that you went with this album as opposed to one with kind of just all the hits, because to me it gave a really good insight to see what were they all about, because I feel you could tell a lot from a band based on B-sides. Do you agree with that a little bit, Mark?
I do, and I'm happy you mentioned that, because I was worried that you were going to say, well, it's just a hits album without House of the Rising Sun.
Right.
So immediately I already feel like, I didn't, it's not strike one just yet.
No, not at all.
I don't know why I'm worried about it, but go ahead.
Yeah, you seem a little nervous, my man. Are you okay?
I am. Well, you killed it with Dion. And, listeners at home, Frank and I take this kind of seriously. Not that we want to one-up each other, but we both kind of want to win this, right? We both
Yes.
want to be the one who goes, man, you gave me that record and
Yes.
it killed it, changed it, you know? And Frank's already, I don't need to remind you guys about Black Love,
Yep.
right? Like, I mean, like Frank's doing fantastic if you've got a scorecard at home. So I was nervous because I made a good pick, but man, that Dion record, son of a bitch.
We do take it seriously. And let me tell you this, that Leatherface album from episode 2, I listen to so often. And I'll even be honest with you, I haven't listened to Cloud Nothing since. So there you go.
Fair enough.
I haven't listened to them. So we take this totally seriously. And if House of the Rising Sun was on this, I'd probably skip over it because I want to hear what was underneath there. So, of course, speaking of hits, we got to get out of this place. I've heard that song, obviously, quite often. And I love that it's the opening track. It's classic sounding, mid-60s here with the guitars and the keyboard. They're playing off of each other. It's great. Take It Easy Baby showcases really the great blues songs, but modernized it, believe it or not, a little bit, where you could really differentiate parts of the songs. And I think they could hang with what the Stones were doing at this time. Mark, do you agree with that? And I know you like some blues.
I do. You picked it up exactly what it was. You know, they did a great job of those early blues records that were clearly so influential on a lot of the early English rock bands, and made it sound like 1965, which is
Right.
really cool. They found a way to separate it. And just since we're doing a little bit, you're going a little track by track, I want to just touch on, we got to get out of this place.
Yeah.
To beat a dead horse, you and I talk about what do you choose to boy, am I stumbling over my tongue. How do you start a record? How do you set the tone for a record?
Yes.
And the sense of urgency on we got to get out of this place. Just such a great way to start a record that as you get into Take It Easy, Baby, you kind of feel a little bit of that like bipolar nature of rock and roll. And I think that for a record that's been kind of jammed together more by the record label than by the band, it's such an interesting take on how to construct an album.
Yeah. Oh, hands down. I totally agree. And what was cool, the Sam Cooke song, which I knew that. My dad used to listen to that. And it's funny, this was released in 62 in the Sam Cooke version, and the Animal Tracks was released in 65. Again, it just goes to show you that time and the influence you had and these songs, and they were really being covered shortly after. I mean, nowadays, of course, listen, and music was just getting started then. I mean, rock and roll wasn't that old, so I understand that concept, but and the context behind it. But I mean, if you think of some of the more well-known modern covers, like that was happening in the 80s or even today, man, the gap was way bigger. I mean, I Love Rock and Roll, right? The original version before Joan Jett covered it in 82 was released in 75. So you have more of a gap there. It wasn't 3 years. Jeff Buckley, Hallelujah, which the cover from Leonard Cohen, I mean, that song was in 84 and then covered in 94. So the gaps were getting wider and wider. Obviously,
that was 1884 he released that.
Yeah, it might be, right?
So old.
It might be.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's more history, right, in the catalog to work with. But again, just amazing how those songs, like what Sam Cooke was doing, influenced a band like the Animals. Again, you agree, right, with the covers being a more common entity on these albums, right? It's just it was a combination again of output and again maybe the influence that these bands were having on each other, right?
Sure, and you know, I think a little bit of sign of the times in terms of what record labels were expecting out of albums.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
You know, when we talked about Super Drag, Head Trip, and Every Key, where we talk about record labels saying we want hits. You know, I think back in the day, this is how record labels ensured we got hits. They found other fantastic songs to put on records. And I mean, how much better of a song do you need than Bring It On Home to Me?
Yeah, totally agree.
I mean,
it's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. The story of Bo Diddley is a fun tune. if I think about it, might be my favorite track. I like the
Really?
yeah. It was really fun. I like how they took the Bo Diddley tune and they kind of expanded on it, and they just took it was their own adaptation of it. Again, I'd have to think about that, but that just came off the cuff, so it could be my favorite tune. I like the keyboard and the narration and talking. I like how it's unpredictable, so it kept me guessing. I mean, the little inserts of "Hard Day's Night" and "I Want to Be Your Man" from the Beatles. That was pretty awesome. So the expansion of this song was totally welcomed, and I think that's kind of what did it for me, because they took this original version of the song and they made it their own.
Yeah, I really thought this was going to be the curveball for you, especially when he gets to reciting a conversation he had with Bo Diddley.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how you would react to it, but I love that you kind of digged it and just went along with it, because it's really indicative of this album of just kind of like, just go with it.
Yeah. Again, it kept me surprised. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I liked it. Now, another famous song, "Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood." I mean, what can I say? This is classic. I think it's one that has held up over so many years. I personally like that Costello version from King of America. But what's also cool about this song is during the South by Southwest keynote speech in 2012, Springsteen stated that this song was the inspiration for the intro to Badlands. And it's pretty cool if you sit down and think about how that's being strummed in the beginning for "Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood," and then you hear Badlands, you're like, oh, there is a correlation there. So that song is cool. That one holds up. I mean, there's nothing more to say about it. It's a classic song that's held up very well throughout the years.
I think the only band who would really fuck it up would be like Smash Mouth.
Do they even play? Are they even play anymore?
Oh, I'm sure they are. I'm sure if you've got like a Snickers candy bar rally for like the girls' school, they'll show up for like $35 and a case of like White Claws or something.
It's absolutely. It's funny you mention them, because my wife was mentioning them the other day about her distaste for them, and I'm like, that first album, they tried to be a ska band, and then they just went, hey, listen, we're going to just throw our hands up here and not even try that and just write absolute shit songs from now on.
Yeah. And I mean, they still got to be rolling in that Shrek money.
Yeah, you would think, right?
Yeah. I wonder, like, they get like $35 every time somebody watches Shrek. Like something ridiculous. They're just making like money hand over fist with that garbage. It's amazing.
That was the I'm a Believer cover. I'm a Believer cover, right? Speaking of covers.
No, well, I believe that's at the end, but if you remember, it's somebody once told me now where we're gonna.
You would be referring to All Star, would you?
I probably am. I mean, I think I owe them $35 now. It's cheaper to buy the record than to sing it.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God. Ugh.
I know.
Crap that band was.
So we go to "I Can't Believe It" and "Club a Go-Go," both possible. They're classic blues rock and early rock sound. Nice guitar work, especially on "Club a Go-Go." I can't say I'm the biggest fan of these styles of songs as far as influencing me to write something, but I was definitely moving the body to them. I get really particular where I'm like, okay, if for me to be like, I love a song, like it has to make me want to pick up the guitar and play something similar at least. But these were definitely not bad tracks at all. Roberta, which is another cover that has a kind of an early 50s rockabilly rock and roll vibe, which I love. My father really loved that sound too. And part of this song, which was interesting, reminded me of the song "The Girl Can't Help It," which ironically is on the Animals' first album. And funny thing about that album is, do you remember the ska band The Hippos, Mark?
I sure do.
Well, the artwork is for their second album is in reference to the Animals' first record.
Oh.
So you go check that out, and you'll definitely see the similarities for those.
Yeah, feel free to leave a comment if you want us to do a Hippos record or not, because maybe you and I are the only ones who remember them. I'm sure Fat Joe remembers them. If you're listening, Fat Joe, hey, buddy. But, That's a very interesting. Good job on fun facting me, Frank.
Right, fun fact. What's funny is the singer for the Hippos is really a prolific producer, audio engineer, mixing engineer, and songwriter, and he's done a lot of stuff with some modern day stuff. So,
what's your top 100
Hippo
things
songs?
he's done outside of the Hippos? I just want his recording and engineering work that's so prolific.
Oh, let's see. He has his production and song. His production and songwriting, 100 of them. Thank you, man. His production and songwriting mixing credits include Madonna, Usher, Adele, Brandon Flowers, the singer of the Killers. Your favorite, got some U2 in here. Your other favorite, Vampire Weekend.
Oh my God! I had no issues with this guy. I immediately hate him.
Can we just talk? Listen, Vampire Weekend is another band that gets like clumped into this like rock, and I've heard it, and it's like easy listening. I have no idea how that's rock and roll, but anyway.
I thought Vampire Weekend was when you take ecstasy with the goth girl and wake up on Monday.
It's what it should, or at least sound like, right?
I would hope so, yeah, but it's probably not. Maybe we should do a Vampire Weekend record, because they might as well be Greta Van Fleet.
I think I want to get you upset for at least an hour and a half and give you a Vampire album.
Yeah, we'll cross that bridge, folks.
We will.
So that guy who told me we were uneducated and what was that nice quote you sent me?
Uninformed drivel, which is uninformed nonsense, basically.
Yeah, that guy's gonna really hate me when we talk about Vampire. All right, so let's get back to the animals. Since I've made you do 100 of the Hippo guys' best work.
Yeah. So we get "Bury My Body," which is a traditional gospel song with an arrangement by the keyboardist Alan Price. To me, this could almost work as like a traditional folk song. It has a central theme that is repetitive and works. And I like the
that organ work is phenomenal, isn't it?
Yeah, and I like the speed midway that it showcases. And then we get For Miss Cockner at the end. It's a good song, and I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites, but it's a nice closeout. So, okay, if I had to wrap this up in a bow and say it, it's an absolute fun record. I am again glad that you recommended it to me and had these B-sides, because it did show me what was underneath the layers. I'm glad it didn't have House of Rising Sun on there, because I'd probably skip over that, to be honest with you. It just because it's been done so many times, so many covers. I'm kind of over that song. So I'm glad I got to hear these collections of songs. I think for their time, they could definitely hang with bands like the Stones who are doing this stuff. The covers were welcomed. The expansions on the song like The Story of Bo Diddley was more than welcomed. A great fun album. I'm in the store. I'm seeing Animal tracks. I will pick it up.
Very cool, man. I'm happy to hear that. Was, like I said, a little nervous, especially after hearing the Dion record, that this wouldn't live up, but love that you found all that depth and all that really cool. I'm just going to stick with depth again. Sorry, folks, I finished that glass of whiskey.
Well, we kind of have to put ourselves in the time too, right? So I can't sit here in 2020 and be like, oh, what were these guys writing? And this is, it's really dated. Well, no, it's 1965. So I really tried to look at what else was being done at that time and compare it there. And, if I was living in that era, I couldn't be putting together this. So, yeah, they have a one-up on me for sure.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Mm-hmm. So Mark, do you want to tell everyone kind of what we're going to do next show and how we're going to go about this?
Yeah, Frank, we're gonna bring the listeners home to Florida. Frank and I have arbitrarily thrown a dart at a map, and we're gonna do bands from different states. We're going to start with Florida. We're going to change the format a little bit. We're going to go track for track like we did with the Greta album, and really just kind of work through these records to see what people like. We're going to throw in a few different things here and there. You're going to see some album versus albums coming up, which should be a lot of fun.
Yes.
We're going to do some different topics like we did with the concerts. But mix it up, maybe we'll talk about a particular record label and the impact they have. Maybe we'll talk about electro. Maybe we'll talk about sub pop. Maybe we'll talk about fat records. we're going to find different things about music that we all kind of think about and talk about and flesh them out for you guys. But that core format of Frank and I going through the records, really trying to find really cool stuff for each other is still going to be the focus here. We're going to start next week with a band from Florida, a band my wife really, 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 really likes. I'm not doing this for her. I'm doing it for Frank because I was surprised that you didn't know this band.
Right.
The band originally from South Florida. I believe they span between the Boca Raton area down to southern Broward and Fort Lauderdale, particularly. I am talking about, I'm talking about Civilian, their album from 2012, Should This Noose Unloosen. It's a personal record. It's an intense record. If I'm trying to classify it for you guys in a subgenre for you, I'm going to call it indie. And I know that that's kind of a bullshit thing, but I really feel like, look, this is a great rock and roll record. It's personal. It's intense. I really think Frank's going to appreciate the lyrics here. And like I said, my wife really likes it. And if that's not enough for you, Frank, then maybe we need to talk about what's good enough for your wife.
Oh, there we go. Hey-o. Now, just to expand off of what Mark said here too with the format, and we're going to be transparent as transparent can be. We recorded that Greta Van Fleet episode, and I tell you what, after that episode offline, we said to ourselves that was the most enjoyable episode we had because we're really able to take this album, dissect it, as Mark said, flesh it out. Yes, he did say flesh, by the way. Really flesh it out and spend time on it. So we're gonna do things like that. We are still gonna have episodes where we talk about two albums, but more pitting them against each other and kind of squaring them off that way. Again, talking about a whole variety of different things. But
do you want to sneak peek that first Versus one and let people wait to hear it, or do we want to wait? We really want to.
Yeah, I want to build it up. Let everyone soak a little bit because it's going to be a two-parter, and I'm super excited about it. I know Mark is as well.
It's going to be a lot of fun. We're really looking forward to this. We're having a great time.
Yes.
Doing this podcast for you guys, mostly because it's me drinking and Frank laughing at that.
Yes.
Which is what we've built a friendship for like 10 years on. So no, it's been longer than that.
Yeah, we'll have to talk offline about this because Mark doesn't know how long we've been friends for.
We definitely have a problem. So we're having a lot of fun doing this.
Try 18 years, okay? So
I was going to say 20, but I knew it felt too long. Because if we had a baby, he could vote, but he could. Yeah, so 18 years. No, but we're really enjoying this. Please, we would love to do more album reviews based on what you guys pick for us.
Yes.
Those will usually be a little bit shorter, a little bit sweeter, right to the point. But feel free, leave us a comment wherever you're listening to us. We will get that comment. We'll find a way to jam whatever album that is into the episode. So don't be shy. If you pick really weird crap, we're just going to call you out on it. So don't try to give me Thriller. Maybe we'll do Thriller.
Maybe.
Don't give me a Celine Dion album. How's that?
Yeah, there you go. And you
try to keep it rock and roll.
Give me any Weird Al album that you guys want to throw at me. So
yeah, Frank can do them almost at the drop of a hat.
Absolutely.
Big silly hat.
And be interactive with us. We are easygoing. You have something to say, you could go ahead and say it. If you have a critique, hey, I'm open, so go ahead and say it.
Yeah, so this is going to be interesting. Most of the time, if you fight with us online, you think it's me because I'm kind of the asshole.
Yeah.
It's totally Frank.
Yes. When the initial complaint, even though I'm responding, could be about Mark. So there you go. Which I'm almost positive the other one was.
Yeah, that's fine. No, fuck that guy. I don't care. Hey, look, this has been Uninformed Dribble. My name is Mark.
There you go.
His name is Frank.
My name is Frank. Thank you guys so much for joining. Again, follow us on Instagram, listen to the episodes on YouTube, or wherever you enjoy a good podcast every now and then. We both thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and we will see you next time.
Have a good one, folks.
Peace.
Bye-bye.